All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of On the Margin. Today, I'm joined by repeat guest Jordi Alexander, who is the CIO at Selini Capital. Jordi, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I want to start kind of high level and get your macro thesis, let's say, for the next 12 months. For listeners' benefit, you guys should all go and listen to an interview that Jordi gave in December of 2021 on Up Only, where he literally calls credit where credit is due, Jordi, almost to the month, exactly what has happened and played out for the first 7 months of this year. So that's why I got to ask you, like, high level, what are the most important things that you're paying attention to? What's your kind of macro framework, let's say, for the next 12 months?
Yeah, sure. I mean, number one is liquidity, right? Like the concept of liquidity drives so much in terms of financial markets, asset prices, and also it kind of filters down through the economy in various ways. Obviously, inflation, as we've seen. So at the time, people were kind of underwater and they just got used to the water, and there was so much liquidity that they were surrounded by that they forgot that, like, this is not necessarily a permanent state. There's also air, and they just hadn't experienced it in quite a while. So, obviously there's been an extreme amount of air, especially in certain markets more than others. But there's what we've been seeing is liquidity situation has moderated. I wouldn't say that. So there's still liquidity going around the system. So that's something I keep an eye on. We can see that households and companies, especially in the U.S. and certain other developed nations, still have a lot of cash. So that's very important, and it changes the narrative in terms of, are we done with inflation? Are we done with tightening? I don't think that we can be done until like liquidity gets under control, and that might take a few more rinses of those cash amounts being kind of dwindled down before we have, a panic of buying real assets, as we've seen. So that's, one big thing I keep an eye on. The other thing is, of course, is relative interest rates across the world, which ultimately I believe is what drives currencies rather than, lack of dollars in countries that use dollar loans. I think interest rates and interest rate policies are crucial. And of course, we're kind of waiting to see the dial that the central banks take between inflation and recession and exactly like where they want to go with that. So I keep an eye on what they say. I want to always know for tactical purposes, like month to month, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. Like they will be forced into certain things that, they might try to tighten too soon, or they might try to over tighten. Those things can matter in the short run, like when you're trading month to month, but when you're trading like on a 6-month horizon, it doesn't really matter because they will get dictated by the economy.
So what are those larger macro forces, right? You kind of talked about liquidity being one force. I know a strong dollar is something that you pay attention to. Why don't we actually start with the strong dollar, right? Because we had Brent kind of on the show recently, and he was explaining his dollar milkshake theory of liquidity getting sucked up into a scarce dollar. And that explains the outperformance of the Dixie, despite, a nine handle on CPI in the US. So why do you think that we're experiencing a strong dollar? Why is that an important thing to pay attention to on the macro stage?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that the US has had this privilege of, the currency that is used around the world that they can print and people will still have demand for. And a lot of it is driven by local currencies cannot really be used as reliable loans, especially for international purposes, because they are not being printed at a reliable rate. And the US dollar was kind of considered a bit more reliable. So it's kind of used as a benchmark for various reasons. But what we saw during 2020, when it really came down to it, the Fed was able to create as many dollars as needed in these bilateral central bank, I forget what they call them now, but the bilateral deposit. Sorry, it's like
we'll look it up.
We'll look it up.
We'll get the name.
Yeah,
Will, my man.
Okay,
he's the man behind On the Margin. Will Beaumont, shout out, Will.
But what we've seen is that the Fed can make dollars available internationally very easily in huge amounts, huge quantities, whatever is needed if there is a crisis. So ultimately what's happening is the US is being forced to raise interest rates, and other countries are lagging. They're starting to also raise interest rates. But places like Japan might not really want to get to 3-4% interest rates because their economy cannot handle it, or the way that their debt is structured cannot handle it. So there is a preference for dollars right now. I think ultimately that gets abused. So my thesis is that this dollar strength starts getting abused because it allows them to print more dollars. So of course it's not that simple. they can't just create dollars. There's a whole process. Printing money is not as simple as printing money. They can buy bonds and they can create like a larger balance sheet, which ultimately needs to get repaid. But it is printing money, and ultimately we can imagine a world where the government thinks about what to do with this money, and it's purchasing power that they can use to buy foreign goods with these dollars. They can buy foreign bonds. We've seen Arthur Hayes' article, for example, suggesting that
Yeah.
the path of least resistance is that they just buy euro and yen denominated bonds. In essence, that solves the dollar problem because you've created more dollars, you've created more supply, and at the same time, you've helped these economies out. Um, it's not clear if you've helped them out because they start owing you their currency, they start owing you debt. So you've bought their debt, and at some point they have to repay it. But it at least alleviates the immediate problem.
Yeah, absolutely. What about like connect this idea of liquidity in the system, right? Because you have kind of two injectors depending on how you look at it. You've got the Fed and you've got the Treasury, right? The Treasury is the issuer of bonds. The Fed is the one who ends up buying those bonds. Everything that we've seen beginning in March of 2020 with this like crazy liquidity bazooka has basically been the Fed injecting liquidity into the system. Now we're starting to see them eke that back, right, through quantitative tightening, which is only just started, right? But markets have responded in a really big way. Walk us through what your framework is for liquidity and how that actually, impacts asset prices. And then do you think we've seen the worst of that receding liquidity? I.e., is the Fed going to be at some point kind of forced right into like some sort of pivot stance? Are they going to try to cheat and inject liquidity in less obvious ways than just the bond buying program that they've had? Like, what's your sort of liquidity outlook for the course of the next like 12 months?
Yeah, sure. I mean, every time they do QE, we see that it lasts for a very long time, and then when they do QT, it seems to be a lot shallower, and each time the balance sheet
And
just
shorter.
grows because it's
Yeah.
very unbalanced. So I expect a lot of that to go forward, and then it just becomes a new normal. It used to be like 1 trillion, then 5 trillion, and now we're getting towards 10 trillion. Like the kind of deficits and the amount of balance sheet that the Fed can ultimately sustain will keep going up, and there is like an indirect inflation that's happening. They're inflating the debt, and everything kind of the music goes on. But what we've
Right.
seen, and this is kind of the critical point that I think will ultimately drive everything, and this matters more than asset prices going down, is actually people, and people who feel that they are no longer able to have purchasing power starting to be very discontent. And the amount of discontent will increase dramatically. It's already been increasing in recent years because of what's considered to be like unfair systems and tax the rich and eat the rich and occupy them, and like all this kind of behavior that we've seen. Trump kind of slowed that down because a lot of the poor people had to politically align themselves with the billionaire class for a while. But ultimately, I think populism, as we've seen with Bernie, as we've seen with parts of what Donald Trump says, is clearly going to win out, and this is happening across the world. We've seen it like in Europe as well. So the thesis that I have, which I only see one way through this, is ultimately nothing else matters. The Fed will try to keep asset prices maybe from completely collapsing, but what's going to be the ultimate solution is providing soft UBI. I don't want to call it UBI because it's not going to be universal. It'll be targeted to specific people and for specific expenses, but it'll try to make the lives of people who are suffering better off so that they keep social cohesion. Because ultimately, their mandate of all these people, for the Fed, it's price stability, it's full employment. All these different institutions have mandates, but the number one mandate is social cohesion. If you lose social cohesion, then you're not a country. So that will supersede everything else.
I tend to agree with you there. There's people like to talk about there's the dual mandate of the Fed, right? With price stability and unemployment being there, and people say, well, price stability supersedes unemployment. But I think there is an even more important, like, right? You're a very good first principles thinker, right? Why is price stability up there? Because really, what they want to do is keep the freaking country together, right? And they're arguably doing a so-so to trending in the wrong direction job of that. So walk us through that though. Why do you think that UBI or some form of targeted UBI has to be the answer? And then what's your guess for how that ends up getting implemented, right? So like what groups of people, right, end up getting that relief? Like, how is that decided? And then what is the transmission mechanism, right? So how do those funds get transferred to people?
Right. So there's two main tools that you can imagine for wealth redistribution, which is kind of what we're talking about, which is necessary. One is taxation and one is benefits. So you can direct benefits at only certain people in certain ways, and you can tax only the rich or only certain types of income. So I think that both of those, we will start seeing we're already starting to see very creative ideas for both. We had, for example, very recently in Spain, they're taxing the banks 5% on their profits, and they're taking that money that's earmarked for that, and they're basically saying free trains. Why do trains and banks have anything to do with each other, and why are the banks paying for trains? This is like the creative kind of redistribution concepts that we'll start to see like more and more in like very large scales than we've currently seen. So this is like in many countries now. They will be called different things. You know, you will start having very like heavy language like fairness and redistribution, and of course you'll have the basics we've already seen, like inflation relief is like one that we're seeing in California, and like you're seeing in the UK with with energy prices. So the problem with taxation and using taxation is it's notoriously difficult, first of all, to pass taxation because the power is very much in the hands of the lobbyists. And you see in the United States how impossible it is to really pass broad tax increases, even when they're sorely needed. And even when you do pass them, of course, lawyers will get involved for like the 0.01%, and they'll find ways around it. They'll move everything abroad. So taxes will happen, but they are very hard to enforce. What's easy to enforce is benefits that are given in a very popular way that actually don't help inflation, but like we said, there's going to be something that supersedes it. So what do people need to spend money on? They need to spend money on rent. They need to spend money on gas. They need to spend money on food. Like these are the basic human needs. If you just look at Maslow's hierarchy, you have to kind of take care of that first base. So the government will kind of step in and make sure that people are taken care of on that level. But of course, this is not going to solve inflation, right?
No, it should make it worse, right? And before we get on to the reason for why that should actually make it worse, I do just want to point out to people, if you're sitting there saying, well, this is America, this would be unprecedented, this would never happen. This has happened numerous times throughout history, right? There's a really good book, Lessons of History, written by Will Arnett. And he literally has this section where he describes this. There's a continuous problem of actually a state that does really well is it tends to produce wealth inequality. And then you step in one of two ways. And he has this great line. It's like either the redistribution of wealth or there's revolution, which redistributes poverty, which is like a really good line. But even before that, it's like Roman Empire, bread and circuses, which is kind of what you're describing, right? Like in their estimation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what people really wanted was food and entertainment, So it's something that's been around for a long period of time. But walk me through like how this ends up impacting, how does this like social thing of like UBI basically transfer payments, right, to support the most base needs of people in the United States? Like, how does that kind of ripple through into financial markets? Because like, even when I was watching like Gavin Newsom, right, and he had this, he reduced the gas tax in California, which makes it easier for people to spend money on gas. That should also drive the price of gas up, right? So all of these programs, I see them as inflationary. I don't know what your thought is on that.
They are inflationary, and my base case for inflation is that it'll come in cycles. It won't go away. It is true that we will start at some point getting 0% month-on-month readings, which will kind of keep prices stable for a few months, and then it'll just spike again. So the year-on-year will not like come down to 2% or like 3%. I think it'll kind of hover around 4 or 5%, and it'll be in spurts around like a lot of these events where there's injections, and then once the injection gets digested, then prices spike, and then we kind of like slow down again. And this is what I imagine as stagnation, and stagflation is kind of getting stuck in this loop. And I think a lot of the correlations in financial markets are in this like loop where if yields start to go down, then asset prices start to go up, and then you see companies overhiring and overspending again, and so inflation goes up, and then you kind of like force them to tighten. So everything is circular right now. Like the way that the forces are set up, there is like a negative feedback loop. So that will kind of like keep us going in this for quite a long time, I think. Now, in terms of
Mm,
exactly how these benefits filter through and how they're implemented, when you think about things from a first principles perspective, it's easier actually to look at the end game and look at the equilibrium and how do things end up. And
yeah.
it's pretty clear that the wealth that's going to get injected, the purchasing power that's going to be kind of loosened into the economy, it can't keep going to asset prices because those are owned by 10% of people, 20% of people. So even though
Mm,
there's some like follow through, ultimately they will have to create wealth targeted for the 50-60% of people. That's going to be like the politically expedient thing to do. So tactically, there's a few ways that can happen, and we can speculate and we can think like, which, imagine like a wall and there's like a huge wave of water kind of coming to the wall. We don't know which holes in the wall it's going to get through, but it's going to get through.
mm.
So, that's a tactical concern, trying to figure out exactly what bill is going to pass and which politician is going to propose it, and who's going to end up being president. But I can assure you that water will get through the other side of that wall.
Yeah. All right, I love. So, what is that end game that you were just kind of hinting at there? Because I got to be honest with, again, with a lens towards history. I mean, I've like the populism. I totally agree with you, right? It's funny because in America, if you polled people, right, and said how similar are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, it's totally separate, right? Like this guy, I love Bernie, right, or I love Trump, right? They are two sides of the same coin, right? This is a strain of populism. It's been around, since the dawn of time. What, like, I don't know if you also love looking at this through history, but like doesn't have a great success rate for countries that end up succumbing to populism. But I also don't see a way around it. I think it's like you're a Sisyphus, right? Pushing the boulder up the hill. Like if you kind of stomp down one politician, like they did with Trump, right? Like we got him out of office, but it doesn't matter because the next time I think you do see a populist president that implements these policies. So, like, describe exactly what that end game is, and then let's have a little fun here. Let's speculate. Like, what are some of the ways that the water can trickle through the wall? To use your example.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be big reactions and reactions to the reactions. So, what I see as being the most likely scenario is that CBDCs at some point end up being kind of like the power tool. This is the trump
Mm,
card, no pun intended, where you will. I mean, we'll see who ends up being the president, but regardless, CBDCs across the world will give central banks and governments power that they've never had before. Not just on the privacy side, which is like something that is separate from all this, but really on the kind of control, they'll be able to target things very directly. And even the Fed that we've seen um, since 2020, they have started to target the economy directly. And there's been
right.
ways that they circumvent the financial system and assets, and they go straight to incentivizing certain behaviors. When we have seen this before, obviously with like the housing market, where there are certain segments of the economy that are targeted. But ultimately, CBDCs give you the level of granularity where you can really decide who gets purchasing power, when do they have to spend it, where can they spend it. In Singapore, we're seeing very interesting experiments where you get a text message on your app. It's saying congratulations, you just got $200. You have to spend it at the food centers that are
Mm,
part of this program, and you have like 2 months to do it. So this is not even a CBDC. This is just like kind of dollars that are put into your like national account. But that's exactly like the type of thing that can be used to direct money and purchasing power and avoid the problems that we're describing where, if you just loosen the economy, it goes to the wrong people. It goes to like the asset rich.
yeah, and there was an example of this: the Fed trying to intervene, right? I mean, 2020 saw a slew of Fed intervention that was pretty unprecedented, right? They bought corporate bonds, but the other thing that they did that was actually a pretty big deal, I don't think it ended up really getting used all that much. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the direct lending facility. It was like the Main Street lending facility where the Fed was actually going to try to lend to small business. And the whole reason why I view this as being meaningfully, like very, very important is again, with a view towards history, like when there are these sorts of situations, right? The next sort of thing that happens is nationalization of businesses, price controls, and administrative bloat, right? The administration sees all these negative things happening and they try to get their hands on it, right? Which you could kind of like, put cement over some of those cracks in the intermediate term, but it tends to be unsuccessful long term. And then the other thing too that I think about listening to you, and we've talked about this on the show before about CBDCs is, Lacey Hunt has this thing where really what you don't want is the liabilities of the Fed to be direct legal tender, right? That's extremely inflationary because then the whole reason we have the Treasury and the Fed separate is so that the liabilities of the Federal Reserve do not become legal tender, which would be extremely inflationary. So I guess let's sorry, I keep breaking this into two-part questions for you. Let's actually address the Lacey Hunt thing first. Do you see that as a big problem that the liabilities of the Fed would basically be legal tender in a CBDC type scenario?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like what actually causes inflation, the money has to kind of get out into people who want to spend it. When you just give money to banks that are not lending it out, obviously that's not actually creating inflation, and it's not getting into like the real economy. So the ultimate question that we have to think about is when purchasing power is limited, because what we've seen is there's a limited supply as well. Like we've talked only about the demand side of the equation, but a lot of the inflation that we're seeing is on the supply side as well. They're both kind of
It
adding
is.
up. Like
Yeah.
we can't know if 9% is 4.5%, 4.5%, or if it's like 3 and 6. And I think those things kind of shift a lot. And obviously, energy is spiking all over the place, and they're trying to use core inflation as being like more steady and more predictive of getting around like the short term spikes. But it is coming from both sides, and we are entering an era where, as we're just seeing right now, with kind of like China and Russia, we are going to have potentially like less globalization. Like there will be like more supply issues as well. So both sides of the equation are adding up into like this sustained reduction in goods. There's not stuff. There's a limited amount of stuff. And my model for like all these things is people are happy to kind of accrue dollars in a bank account, and that doesn't cause inflation because it's just something that they're happy to be rich. They're saving things. But then at some point there's like a rush for the exits. And I don't want to bring up crypto too much, but we do see this in crypto where a token like Olympus DAO or something, it just kind of accrues, it goes up and up and up and up. And then suddenly when somebody wants to spend it, everybody else rushes out and everybody wants to spend it to buy like real stuff. So the dollar is actually, even though it's the strongest currency, it's still just fiat. It's just paper. Ultimately, like it can get debased, and people will go through these spurts of wanting to buy real assets. And when they're seeing all the houses on their street starting to get sold, and they have plans to buy a house, to upgrade or whatever they want to do, they will use all their savings to rush and at the same time buy that house, and we'll kind of like have these inflationary spikes, which is people trying to get out of the shit coin. So the shit coin being the US dollar in this case, into like a real asset, which, in is like a house, or it could be like real goods, like a car, used cars even end up being like the real asset.
To your point, I do see a bunch of inflationary forces kind of stacking up. We've got geopolitical stress, which is going to limit the abilities of companies to outsource supply chains, borrow from low-cost labor pools. That's one really big thing, right? We've got, everything that you're just discussing, basically, which is, there's like the supply and demand side, right? We print dollars. That's how the Fed tends to solve problems. We've got demand side inflation. And then finally, the thing to me that's just so interesting is like we have it's been the same thing that's worked, right, for the last 20 years. Like the way the government gets through, we print more money and it seems to paper over the problem. Whereas like this might be where the rubber kind of meets the road. So like how effective do you see the government at kind of tamping down and getting us through all these problems versus like what is the risk surface area that they might not be fully exploring?
Yeah. So to answer your question, I think we're going to see some very interesting geopolitical games where, ultimately it's going to be everyone for themselves. Everyone's going to have to look after their own people, their own local people. So, the dollar starts becoming a weapon that, like we talked about, they can print, they can get out of their own problems here in the United States, as long as other countries are willing to buy dollars and buy bonds and kind of be willing to accept the dollar. So I think the way this plays out is the dollar at some point, as Jeffrey Gundlach and others have talked about, the end game for the dollar is to get weaker and to be threatened as the reserve currency, because it will get abused. It will get abused because as long as it's in that status, it will be too tempting to kind of keep using it to support, the local population and create more purchasing power for the local economy, and that of course hurts like the international economy. So as long as that dollar is in that position, it will be too tempting to use it for that purpose. So at some point there will be a backlash against the dollar. The question is what happens then, and that's where it gets very interesting. So I don't think many countries around the world will be thrilled to use like a digital yuan. I'm sure China will try to popularize it as much as possible. The euro is in a whole different other world of hurt. I mean, the euro, first of all, as a concept, has, what we've always known. Like you said, it's kind of worked for 20 years now. The euro has survived with like printing money and helping Spain and Italy and Greece at the right times and kind of keeping it up. But we're at the point where a lot of these like cycles are starting to like hit inflation that they didn't do before.
Mm.
And, how are they going to keep Bund BTP spreads between Germany and Italy, for example, from blowing out? They're saying that trust us, like we're like putting some fancy names on things, and we will get involved and we'll find a way to do it. But I think when the market calls their bluff, they will start having quite a hard time, and especially if the political situation in Italy is not one that they trust. Now that they've lost Draghi, who was obviously, as the ECB chair, he's somebody that is very much, trusted by everyone at the ECB. If you start having a politician in charge who's very populist and talking like anti-Europe rhetoric, will they go so far as to, sacrifice their economies for Italy? I don't think so. So you start seeing that Europe has kind of done this crazy experiment, which was try to increase political unity by having monetary unity. And I think it's very likely that countries start falling out of the euro if their interest rate policy, their monetary policy does not line up with the whole. So the euro will not necessarily challenge the dollar either, because they're going to have possibly exits. I do think the political unity of Europe stays because of threats like Russia, as we've just seen, will cause the political unity of Europe to stay together. But in terms of like the monetary unity, the single currency, the common currency, that will be very threatened. And I think Italy will probably be the first one in the next 2 years, I would say, depending on who gets elected and what their policies will be. Where I just see that will be a huge problem. So what's left? I'm sure Bitcoin people would love to say like, this is where like hyper Bitcoinization comes in, and like this is the alternative. Maybe to some extent. Like I think there will be a subsection of the global population. Like you will see people in different countries adopt Bitcoin, and it will become like a global piggy bank in a way. But I don't see Bitcoin as being following the kind of example of what El Salvador did, where it will be like a national currency that companies will need to have on their balance sheet. I see it as more of like a populist reaction to the fiat kind of control that's been given, and people will want to have something that's not controlled. And it's possible that the amount of people that use Bitcoin 10x's, but it still doesn't mean it will be in the central bank balance sheet.
I know you're an advocate for Bitcoin and just sound money generally, right? Like I listened to an interview you did where you actually held some of your trading gains in gold before discovering Bitcoin, which is awesome. Walk me through like the bull case for Bitcoin. If you had to just say like, here's what the ultimate vision of what it can be, here's how it might get there. And then walk me through kind of the bear case, and maybe we could dig in deeper to some of the problems that you were just alluding to. So let's start with the bull case. Like how could the hyper Bitcoinization be right? Or maybe differently phrased, what is the ultimate best outcome that you see Bitcoin realistically achieving?
I see so many problems with it becoming the global one currency. I mean, apart from the long-term issues that Bitcoin still needs to figure out. So Bitcoin's greatest strength is its greatest weakness. Its greatest strength is that it's very predictable. You know what it is, it's not changing. And the core Bitcoin is so against change that they will fight these like big block wars, and they will just keep carrying on with a tiny block. They will fight any change to the protocol. So even if somebody says, guys, like we need to fix like the security concern, at some point, in 100 years, like miners will not be incentivized to create security for the network because they're not getting enough Bitcoin. The strength, which is the predictability and the immutability, and like nobody wants to change anything, will at certain points become a huge weakness, because when there's a need to pivot, there might be a lot of people who just say, well, it doesn't matter. Just let it die. Like just let it kind of get exploited. Doesn't matter if there's no miners. Like it has to stay immutable. Like there will be like these orthodox kind of Bitcoiners as we've seen them. Like they're very loud. So that's like a huge weakness as well. And things that hold Bitcoin back, like for example, the denomination. There's 21 million Bitcoin. When you have billions of people potentially using this thing, it probably sounded better to them to have more than one Bitcoin rather than have 0.00 6 Bitcoin. So
Mm,
no one is gonna allow that to happen though. Like no one is gonna, if we just say, hey guys, let's add like a million, so it's 21 trillion, and then people can just have a lot of them because that's what they're used to with dollars. They're used to having a lot of the currency. It'll still be everything the
mm.
same. We just like add some zeros to the end. The orthodoxy will just like fight that, like, no, this is like how it was intended, like we're not going to touch anything. So I can't see scenarios where Bitcoin becomes much bigger than um, a freedom tool and a kind of like a flag for like liberals around the world and people who want to kind of take their democracy into their own hand and like have their monetary control. And that's still very big. I mean, many multiples from where we are now. But is this going to be what countries use as their currency? Probably not. They will want to keep monetary control under themselves.
Drew, let me ask you almost like an ontological question here. Do you think there is a perfect structure for a monetary system that can last for, let's say, thousands of years? Because if you go back and look at different monetary systems that we've had, my mental framework for it is you pick one, it's not perfect, it works for a certain period of time, and then things get so bad, like the fatal flaw of that monetary system gets so bad that you do a counter reaction to it, right? And you go all the way in the other direction. Then that works for a little while, and you're kind of making this like seesaw progress forward. But like, do you think there is something out there that we just haven't discovered yet that's the perfect monetary solution here, or are we just doomed to kind of figuring out like incrementally better systems, and we're just going to do this kind of back and forth?
I think, people, I mean, I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I think there are characteristics that are perfect, that, this is the
Mm,
characteristic ultimately that you want. Um, Now, whether there's a system that can take all the perfect characteristics and put them together, it's very difficult because one of the things that you want to have, for example, is like a reasonably fair distribution. You can't have some people, if you take Bitcoin, for example, if, the Winklevosses end up having like 5% of the world's like purchasing power because they just refuse to sell their Bitcoin and they just want to write it up to like Valhalla, right? Um, right. So at some point, like the unfairness of the distribution will end up being so great, the system will collapse upon itself. It'll kind of be like the reaction that you talked about. So creating a fair distribution, whatever that means, which we can discuss what that means, that's the perfect characteristic. But in terms of what system can most closely like fit onto that line, it's hard to say. Like what is fair, what is too much. I would say that if you want something to succeed, my mental construct is look at the incentives. I think incentives rule the world. Everything is about incentives.
mm,
So
me
if
too.
if you want like a certain currency or a certain monetary system to succeed, who is incentivized to support it and who is not incentivized to support it and possibly fight it? So, with something like Bitcoin, yeah, you might get a lot of people who then elect senators, and then the senators will be supporting it. And you have ways where it does kind of end up having certain power. But if somebody owns too much and other people don't own enough, ultimately, like there's a barrier to how much the incentives can get distributed. So if somebody just tells you like, oh, we've created, this is like better than Bitcoin, this is like the perfect asset, um, that's fine. But like as we know, if you're the only one who owns it, or you and your friends are the only ones who own it, it actually has no value because all you can do is trade with your friends, and that really doesn't matter. So ultimately, you have to think about distribution. We've seen the extreme thought process around something like WorldCoin. Do you know WorldCoin? They have this orb.
Yeah,
They're going around the world.
yeah,
They're scanning people's
yeah. I
irises,
know.
and their concept is we will be able to airdrop everybody and create value through the distribution. The distribution will be so wide because everyone in the world will get this airdrop of coin, and you won't be able to like get two because your eyeball is only one. But
Yeah,
that doesn't work either because like even just give it a month, and then somebody will go to Africa and like pay a few pennies and just like buy millions of these things, while people in other countries just have like one. So like you said, there is no perfect. There's only trying to kind of create something that works for that space and time. And it is possible that something like Bitcoin is kind of what we need now. I do think that gold this is of course controversial in the macro world, but I do think that gold has seen its best days behind it, and I think that we might not really get the resurgence of gold ever again. I think its narrative might be dead.
Mm. Why do you think that?
So Bitcoin as a digital version of gold has so many superior characteristics. And this is talking to somebody who I literally had like 90% of my wealth in gold futures. I mean, I got delivered upon by mistake in like the vault in CME, and I had to like accept
No
like,
way. Really?
Bitcoin. I said I had to accept gold, like physical gold, and like figure out how to deal with that. The problem with gold is like the distribution. Central banks, especially the U.S. central bank, just has way too much of it. They can control it. Two, it's obviously like so hard to move around. It's so hard to send any to this. Like verifying that it's real gold. All of these things have been talked about. I think scarcity being replicated in a digital version in Bitcoin is just so much superior that in 20, 30 years, where like the millennials and the Zoomers are the ones who are kind of in positions of power. I can't see like in 30 years that there's going to be that many believers in gold, and the only ones who have the incentive, like as we've said, to tell us that gold is like the right hard money are people like the U.S. government who owns most of it, or China and Russia who are also buying it. So it's governments or people who are maybe like 70, 80, like 50, 60, 70 years old that will have to pass on their wealth.
What does this mean for the rest of crypto in general if Bitcoin ends up succeeding? Because one of the difficulties of investing in Bitcoin, actually, from a psychological standpoint, is that when it goes up, right, the dog coins, right, so to speak, to like broadly label a whole bunch of a category of tokens, goes up even more, right? And then when crypto's going down, the difficulty is like, well, you don't really want to even own Bitcoin, then you want to own cash, right? So walk me through like how you're thinking about the rest of the crypto ecosystem. Maybe you want to touch on ETH and what they're trying to build, and then like maybe this other whole kind of like speculative universe of coins out there as well, like as separate ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've kind of written some articles about this, and I present it as a tragedy of the commons, where there's higher beta coins, like you said, like there's dog coins and higher beta coins, and if people are just seeing Bitcoin go up and they're seeing the digital ecosystem's wealth go, the market cap of all digital assets go from 1 trillion to 3 trillion, and they want to ride that wave, and they see like something being higher beta, they start on an individual basis being incentivized to just kind of move to the higher beta coins, first ETH and then like the L1s and then kind of down the chain. And if everybody does that, then the whole system collapses upon itself and it kind of creates this like, everyone loses dynamic. The way that's going to change in the long run is the people who own Bitcoin, who acquire the wealth, are not going to be the people that are, chasing gambling narratives and like trying to kind of run up money. The way this all changes in 10 years, I'm very confident that we will no longer have that effect, is because the people who will own Bitcoin at that point will be people who are trying to save money. Like they're trying to like save their purchasing power across the world. They're not looking to gamble. Right now, most of the Bitcoin is held by people who are kind of, like a lot of them believe in the asset, but a lot of them kind of like riding, like these waves and these cycles, and they kind of want to create wealth for themselves that is not necessarily like philosophically aligned with just purchasing power. So that'll change. The holder base will change, and ultimately that's what will drive the change in like the correlation with some of these smaller coins. We do need to go through maybe like one more cycle. I don't think everyone's smart enough yet. I think there has to be like one more cycle of kind of getting into like all these like tail assets that eventually explode, as we've seen.
Yeah.
But we have very interesting other things going on in crypto, which is what I really kind of find fascinating about crypto, is that you have this combination of technology and incentives. So you have social constructs and you have code. Code is law. So Ethereum is going through a huge change. We can speculate as to whether this will be like a long-lasting push where Ethereum ends up, really establishing itself as like a macro asset, if you will, where it becomes like either a commodity or a currency. Both are possible. It can become a currency if the amount of people that use Ethereum every day become enough like a country, and kind of like the amount of protocols, end up looking like the GDP of a country. So that's possible, but it's quite far away. I think like you can You can even look now, despite the price increase, it's quite cheap to use Ethereum right now. You can send transactions very cheaply. Block space is not very expensive. Um,
Mm.
but it's possible that Ethereum becomes a commodity where block space does become very valuable. So these things remain to be seen. It's quite interesting to follow. There's a lot of dependencies that it relies upon. But then there's
Yeah.
also all these other things happening in the crypto space. We're ultimately looking for use cases for a lot of uh, the tech that's being built. So as a first step, we need the tech, right? We need L1s, we need bridges, we need cheap and reliable and good wallets. We need all these things. So these are being built, and that's very important. What's gonna matter is the apps ultimately. So
Mm.
the next stage that we need to get to is super apps. Just like Facebook is being used by billions of people, we're gonna need those type of apps to find a use case where the decentralization nature, or maybe like the Web3, tokenization, is useful enough that it becomes a core part of the app, and then crypto has billions of people using it because of the apps.
Yeah, I would say, one of the so like that ultimate, that's the white whale, right? That's the adoption, the use cases, the actual people using this stuff for anything other than speculation. I will say, like, one thing that I haven't read Balaji's network state yet. I don't know if you've come across that or if you're familiar with the concept there. But I used to ask myself all the time, like, why does crypto need to be so tribal? I don't understand this. Like, it eventually won't be like this. And I eventually have started. It's not the way I'd prefer it, but I think I've started to see it as more of a feature than a bug, actually. And I actually see the value in it. And I don't think that's going to change, actually. And you're going to get these kind of disparate communities. But that's a whole other, we could do a whole podcast on that. I want to close things with basically sum up what we've talked about so far, because I've kind of seen two different options here that the world could go in, right? And a lot of it is dictated by the government or the Fed or the powers that be. But option number one, we basically try to retrace all of the policies that we've undertaken in the last 2 years, right? So that would look like withdrawal of liquidity from the system. That would be some kind of mean reversion in terms of asset prices, some sort of prolonged recession, right? Where growth and supply and demand kind of level here. So that kind of tamps down on the inflation problem, and we solve things that way. Then there's option B. And option B is we say, the debt is too much, right? Debt to GDP is too high. We're never going to work through this in an organic way. It's politically impossible to have any measures of austerity. And instead, what we're going to do is kind of sneakily inflate the debt away. And that's where you see a lot of the stuff that we're talking about at CBDC, and just more like UBI, just more government intervention to basically bridge the gap from A to B. It sounds like you are kind of in that second camp, B. So yes, no, are you in that second camp? And then more concretely, what does that look like specifically for asset prices in the next year? Because I gotta get a couple predictions here. Maybe if you want to talk about cryptos, equities, and let's leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, the cat's out of the bag. I don't think A is possible. When you inflate these assets, you create this opportunity for people to go back into dollars. Why are they going to just let you deflate them back and let you take everything back? It's too late. So you ultimately have to get creative. You have to go to option B. You have to keep intervening. This is the sad part. We obviously want free economies. We want capitalism, but that's not what we're going to get. And it's not even what would work at this point. We do need very smart intervention. We need a very good chef who will just carefully take a little bit here, take a little bit there, and just use a scalpel and kind of do it carefully. I don't think we're going to get very expert surgeons. I mean, you see Lagarde, they ask her a question, how are you going to get this under control? And she just has this smirk, oh, you'll see, it'll happen. Yeah. And Powell is not much better. The amount of things that Powell says in some of these press conferences, which is just shocking to hear. I mean, I have to agree with Larry Summers. The most recent press conference with Powell, where he's talking about being at a neutral rate, and we may already be there, and kind of some of these while we have a 9.1% inflation. So I don't trust them that they will make good decisions, but the economy does need intervention. We can't just let the free economy take over right now, unfortunately. So I do think that we see attempts where it's a soft landing, where they just kind of carefully inflate a little bit here and then redistribute, keep people from rioting, take a little bit more, and just try to keep everything going. And then the hard landing, which is kind of, they do that, but they don't do it well. And that does cause like mass riots, and people end up hungry, and they just haven't done it well. And crime goes out of control. So there is like a bad and good scenario depending on how well they handle it, but it will definitely be B. It will not be A. They won't just be able to kind of suck it back in the way that it got released. So asset prices, they do depend a little bit on where on that spectrum they want to go between, taking it slowly and going hard. As we've seen, like Powell is an uber dove. The way he got elected or appointed, because it's not an elected position, is, there's this beauty contest, and they look at all the governors, and the president just wants to, it's obviously true of Trump, but it was true of like other presidents as well.
Yeah.
They want to choose the one. Sure. They want to say like, who's the dovish of them all? Who's the most dovish, out of everybody?
Mirror, mirror on the wall.
Exactly.
Who's the most dovish?
So Yellen was the most dovish for a while, so she got the spot. And then Powell kind of, showed that he was even more dovish. So despite being bullied by Trump let him carry on because he knew that he was the most dovish. And we just saw that, he showed his true colors. So I think asset prices kind of just fluctuate and go sideways in cycles. I think they can't go up too much. I would sell every like substantial rally, because every substantial rally will prolong the inflation problem that we'll have to get taken care of. And they can't drop completely, because at some point they will show their true selves. It will become very dovish. So I think equities specifically go sideways in this kind of like sine wave. And that can happen. It's hard to predict a horizon, but I think like at least, for the next year, and it could be much longer than a year, but at least like within that horizon, we'll kind of see this like sine waves on equities. Bonds, I think, will have a collapse at some point, and that's where it gets really interesting. We will possibly see the concept of yield curve control if no one is willing to buy U.S. debt, and that will only happen once the fiscal policy and the government spending starts up again. So there will be this concept of other countries saying they will no longer buy U.S. debt, and then who's going to buy it? So we have seen historical contexts where they force pensions to buy them, they force banks to buy them. Like the local population is forced to actually buy these things because nobody will buy them, and it's possible that we get to something like that. So I would say bonds still have room to go down, and especially the long end. At some point, we'll have a crisis on the long end. Crypto, I think, will outperform equities. There is more kind of potential for returns there, and I think we're seeing increasing amounts of mind share kind of getting absorbed into crypto. So I do think that tactically you can do well in crypto, but it's hard to choose the right coins. And I would say right now, I don't think is the time to go like super long, even like the prime assets. I do believe that crypto is ultimately driven by reflexivity. And what I ask myself every morning is, do I have FOMO right now? Like, am I worried that if I don't buy like, X amount of Bitcoin that I am able to purchase, like, let's say I can afford like, 10 Bitcoin. If I don't buy the 10 Bitcoin right now, do I have FOMO that like in a month, the price will be like, I will be like this meme on Twitter that I will be sidelined in fiat. Am I scared I will be sidelined in fiat? I will no longer be able to buy 10 Bitcoin in a month. If so, then like I should do something about it. But right now I don't feel any FOMO. I think like we're going to have like more dips and more trouble ahead. So until like there's like a real sense of FOMO, I think crypto is still going to stay moderate, but at some point it will shoot up.
Awesome. Jordi, that's sage advice. Unfortunately, I feel like we could keep talking for 2 more hours, but that is all the time we have. If folks want to find out more about you, figure out what you're doing, your fun, follow you on Twitter, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, at Game Theorizing, Twitter is the best way to find me.
Awesome. Jordi, this has been a ton of fun, my friend. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mike.